The morning sun cast long shadows across Revolution Avenue in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. It was 8 a.m., and the city was slowly waking up to another day. Shopkeepers rolled up their shutters with practiced ease, the metal grinding against concrete in a familiar morning symphony. Schoolchildren in crisp uniforms darted between pedestrians, their laughter cutting through the humid air. Street vendors called out their wares, their voices competing for attention in the growing cacophony of urban life. On this very avenue stood a small, unassuming shop that had witnessed 15 years of the city's secrets, sorrows, and celebrations. The sign above the door read simply, "Mamado's Barber Shop." It was weathered by time, the paint peeling at the edges, but it remained a beacon for those seeking more than just a haircut. Inside, the shop was modest to the point of Spartan. A single cracked mirror hung on the wall, its silver backing worn in places, creating ghostly distortions. A small ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, doing little to combat the heat, but providing a comforting rhythm to the space. 3 wooden chairs sat near the entrance, their surfaces polished smooth by countless waiting customers, each one carrying the invisible weight of stories shared and burdens lifted. But the true soul of this establishment was Mamado himself. A man in his late 40s, Mamado had skin the color of rich mahogany, weathered by sun and time. Deep lines creased his face, evidence of years spent laughing, worrying, and listening. Yet his eyes held an unmistakable spark of life, a vitality that drew people to him. He was not merely a barber who cut hair, he was a silent witness to people's lives, a keeper of confidences, a sculptor not just of appearances, but of spirits. For 15 years, Mamado had stood in this very spot, scissors and comb in hand, transforming not just the physical appearance of his clients, but offering them a sanctuary where they could speak freely. Politicians would lower their guards here, revealing doubts they couldn't share in Parliament. Young men would confess their romantic troubles, seeking advice disguised as casual conversation. Elderly men would reminisce about the country's colonial past and dream of its independent future. Mamado absorbed it all with the patience of a confessor and the discretion of a vault. His work extended far beyond the mechanical act of trimming hair. He knew which clients wanted conversation and which sought silence. He could sense when someone needed encouragement or when they required gentle honesty. His scissors moved with the precision of a surgeon, but it was his empathy that truly set him apart. Every day was special in its own way, bringing new faces, new stories, new threads in the tapestry of human experience. But today, this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become extraordinary in ways that Mamado could never have imagined. Today would mark the moment when a simple barber would become a pivotal figure in international intrigue, when the casual observer would transform into a crucial witness, when silence would give way to a truth that could shake the foundations of global power. As Mamado swept the floor, preparing for his first customer, he hummed an old song his mother had taught him, something about honesty being the sweetest fruit. He had no idea how prophetic those lyrics would prove to be. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery next door, mixed with the earthy smell of the street after last night's brief rain. Mamado paused in his sweeping, looking out at Revolution Avenue. The name itself was a reminder of Burkina Faso's turbulent history, its struggle for independence, its ongoing fight to determine its own destiny without foreign interference. Little did he know that this very struggle was about to enter his small shop in the most unexpected way possible. At precisely 8:30 a.m., a plain white car pulled up in front of Mamado's shop. There was nothing remarkable about it, no flags, no insignia, no tinted windows suggesting official importance. It stopped smoothly at the curb, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the rear door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed simply, wearing casual trousers and a button-down shirt, the kind any middle-class professional might wear. But there was something about his bearing, the way he carried himself, that suggested this was no ordinary customer. His movements were deliberate, confident, without being arrogant. He looked both ways down the street, not with paranoia, but with the natural awareness of someone accustomed to public attention. This was President Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, though you wouldn't know it from his appearance. He had deliberately chosen to forego the typical presidential protocol: no motorcade, no security detail forming a visible perimeter, no advance team securing the location. This was his way, his philosophy of leadership. He believed that a president who couldn't walk among his people without an army was a president who had already lost their trust. "Assalamu alaikum, Mamado," Ibrahim said with a warm smile as he approached the shop entrance. Mamado's eyes widened slightly in recognition, though he had trained himself never to show excessive surprise. Over the past few months, the president had become something of a regular customer, visiting every few weeks for a simple trim. But the novelty of having a head of state in his chair had never quite worn off. "Wa alaikum assalam, Mr. President," Mamado replied, quickly moving forward to open the door wider. "The usual style today?" Ibrahim laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to lighten the air around him. "Just a little cleaning up, Mamado. And how many times must I tell you, when I'm here, I'm just Ibrahim. No titles, no formality. That's precisely why I come here." Mamado nodded respectfully, gesturing toward the old leather chair that had been the centerpiece of his shop since the day he opened it. The chair had been second-hand even then, purchased from a closing shop in the market district. It had carried thousands of people, each one leaving an invisible imprint. Now it was about to hold someone at a historic crossroads. As Ibrahim settled into the chair, Mamado draped a clean cape over him and began his ritual. He picked up the spray bottle and misted Ibrahim's hair lightly, the water catching the morning light streaming through the window. The familiar routine was soothing, a dance they had performed several times before. The tension that Ibrahim carried in his shoulders began to ease as Mamado's skilled hands worked through his hair, checking the length, planning the cut. This was the magic of the barber shop, this ability to create a pocket of normalcy, a refuge from the tremendous pressures of leadership. "You know, Ibrahim," said after a comfortable silence, "this shop is my therapy. When I come here, I remember that I'm just a man, not a symbol or a target or a chess piece in someone else's game." Mamado smiled as he began cutting, the scissors making their soft snipping sound. "President or farmer, we all need our hair cut. And in this chair, everyone is equal. The scissors don't care about your title." It was this philosophy that had made Mamado's shop a beloved institution on Revolution Avenue. Doctors sat next to taxi drivers. Teachers waited alongside merchants. In Mamado's chair, the artificial hierarchies of society dissolved, leaving only the common humanity they all shared. They talked about everyday things as Mamado worked: the local football team's recent victory, the rising cost of rice, and the new ice cream vendor on the corner who had invented an unusual flavor combining hibiscus and ginger that was surprisingly good. These were the conversations that grounded Ibrahim, reminded him of what actually mattered to the people he served. "My daughter," Ibrahim said with a chuckle, "has become obsessed with that ice cream. She insists we go there every Sunday after prayers. I think the vendor recognizes us now, though he's polite enough not to make a fuss." "Children know what's important," Mamato replied, trimming around Ibrahim's ears with careful precision. "They haven't learned to complicate life yet. They see something good and they pursue it without overthinking." "Perhaps we should all be more like children in that way," Ibrahim mused, "though I suppose running a country requires a bit more calculation." The conversation continued in this easy manner, touching on nothing consequential, which was precisely what made it valuable. In a life filled with weighty decisions and constant scrutiny, these moments of ordinary human connection were precious beyond measure. But their peaceful interlude was about to be shattered in a way neither man could have anticipated. Sometimes history doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it arrives as quietly as a phone call, slipping into the world through the most mundane of portals. Ibrahim's phone, resting in his pocket, began to vibrate. The vibration was subtle, barely noticeable under the cape, but Ibrahim felt it immediately. He had conditioned himself to always be aware of his phone, that electronic leash that connected him to his responsibilities. Most calls he could ignore when in private moments like this. His staff knew not to disturb him unless it was genuinely urgent. But when he glanced at the screen, his expression shifted. The smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth disappeared, replaced by something more serious. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes lost some of their warmth. Mamato noticed the change immediately. After 15 years of reading people's faces, he had become expert at detecting shifts in mood, the subtle tells that indicated something was wrong. "Mamato," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I need to take this call. Do you mind?" "Of course, Mr. President. Take your time." Mamato stepped back respectfully, setting down his scissors and comb on the small table beside the chair. But something felt different about this moment. Ibrahim, in all his previous visits, had never answered a call during a haircut. He had once joked that the barber shop was his phone-free zone, a sacred space where the outside world couldn't intrude. The fact that he was breaking this unspoken rule suggested the call was extraordinary. Ibrahim stood from the chair and moved toward the back corner of the shop, near the small window that looked out onto a narrow alley. The morning light streaming through created a silhouette effect, casting his face partially in shadow. He pressed the phone to his ear and spoke in a low voice. "This is President Traoré." Mamato turned away, busying himself with arranging his tools, trying to give Ibrahim as much privacy as the small space allowed. But the shop was tiny, barely 15 feet from front to back. And despite Ibrahim's attempt to speak quietly, Mamato's ears were sharp, trained by years of listening to customers who spoke softly about sensitive matters. What he heard next would change not only his life, but potentially the course of his nation's history. The voice on the other end was speaking English with an American accent, clear and authoritative. Even through the phone speaker, Mamadou could detect the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who wielded power as naturally as breathing. "Mr. President, this is Director Harrison from the Africa Division." Mamadou's heart skipped a beat. The Africa Division. That could only mean one thing. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. The name itself carried weight, associated with decades of interference, coups, and covert operations across the African continent. And now, impossibly, a representative of this agency was calling the president directly, bypassing all normal diplomatic channels. Mamadou's hands, which had been arranging bottles of hair tonic, became very still. He found himself holding his breath, straining to hear more, while simultaneously feeling guilty for eavesdropping. But how could he not listen? This was no ordinary conversation. Ibrahim's response was measured, carefully controlled. "I wasn't expecting your call, Director. Our official communications typically go through diplomatic channels. This is highly irregular." The American's voice came through again, and this time Mamadou could hear it more clearly. The man seemed unconcerned about protocols, speaking with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Sometimes official channels are too slow, Mr. President, especially when we need to discuss matters of regional stability. Your recent comments about reviewing our military assistance agreements have caused some concern in Washington." Mamadou felt a chill run down his spine, despite the morning heat. This wasn't a friendly call. This was something else entirely, something that carried the weight of threat beneath its diplomatic veneer. Ibrahim remained calm, his voice steady. "We are simply reviewing all foreign partnerships, as is our sovereign right. Burkina Faso must make decisions that serve the interests of our people first." There was a pause, and Mamadou could almost feel the tension building in that silence. Then the American spoke again, and his words would echo in Mamadou's mind for the rest of his life. "Mr. President, we have considerable resources in Burkina Faso's security. We have people within your government who understand the importance of this partnership. It would be very unfortunate if your administration were to face internal challenges because of hasty policy changes." The implication was crystal clear. The CIA had assets, agents, or informants embedded within Burkina Faso's government itself. They were telling the president in barely veiled terms that they could destabilize his administration from within if he didn't comply. Mamadou's body went rigid. He stood frozen near his tool table, a bottle of aftershave still in his hand, processing what he had just heard. This wasn't diplomatic negotiation. This was blackmail, delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon's knife. Ibrahim's shoulders tensed. Though his voice remained controlled, Mamadou could see the anger building in the set of his jaw, the way his free hand had clenched into a fist. "Director Harrison, I believe this conversation has reached its conclusion." But the American wasn't finished. He delivered his final blow with devastating casualness. "Your predecessor, President Kabore, understood the value of our friendship. That's why he remained in power as long as he did. Unfortunately, when he stopped cooperating, well, you saw how that ended." The line went dead. Ibrahim stood motionless for a long moment, the phone still pressed to his ear, even though the call had ended. His fingers gripped the device so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. Mamadou could see the president's chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, as if he were physically restraining himself from an outburst. The shop was silent, except for the slow rotation of the ceiling fan, its blades cutting through the thick air. Outside, life on Revolution Avenue continued its normal pace, completely unaware that inside this small barber shop, a line had been crossed, a threat had been delivered, and two men now shared knowledge that could prove dangerous to them both. Finally, Ibrahim turned around. His face was carefully composed, but his eyes burned with barely suppressed fury. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but intense. "Mamadou, did you hear that conversation?" The question hung in the air between them. Mamadou stood at a crossroads in that moment. He could lie, claim he had been focused on his work and heard nothing. It would be safer, simpler. He could remain the invisible Barber, the silent witness who saw and heard everything, but never acknowledged it. But as Mamadou looked at Ibrahim's face, at the mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like hope, he knew he couldn't lie. Some moments demanded truth, no matter the cost. "Yes," Mamadou said quietly, "I heard some of it." Ibrahim's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer. "How much?" Mamadou swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what he was about to admit. "He said you have people in your government who work for them. He mentioned someone named Harrison from the Africa Division. And he talked about Operation Harmattan, something about regional stability." Ibrahim's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise that Mamadou had heard so much, concern about the implications, and then something else, something calculating. The president moved back to the barber chair and sat down slowly, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Your English is better than you let on," Ibrahim said, but there was no accusation in his tone, only observation. "My father believed education was the key to everything. He made sure I learned English well, even though we had little money. He said the colonizers' language could be a weapon if we mastered it." Ibrahim nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his recent calls until he found the number that had just called him. His finger hovered over it for a moment before he looked up at Mamadou. "What I am about to do," Ibrahim said carefully, "is dangerous. But I need you to listen to every word, Mamadou. Can I trust you?" Mamadou thought of his wife, his children, his small shop that represented years of hard work. He thought of the life he had built through careful neutrality, never taking sides, never getting involved in politics. Everything in his practical mind screamed at him to decline, to excuse himself, to return to the safety of invisibility. But he also thought of his country, of the casual arrogance in that American voice, of the implication that Burkina Faso's sovereignty was merely an illusion maintained at the pleasure of foreign powers. He thought of his children and the future they would inherit. "Yes," Mamadou said, his voice stronger than he felt, "you can trust me." Ibrahim nodded once decisively and then pressed the call button. What happened next would transform a simple barber into one of the most important witnesses in modern African history. The phone rang twice before Director Harrison answered, his voice immediately taking on a slightly warmer tone, perhaps assuming Ibrahim was calling back to capitulate. "Mr. President, I'm glad you're calling back. I hoped we could continue our discussion more productively." But Ibrahim's approach was completely different now. His voice, which had been firm and resistant during the first call, now carried a note of uncertainty, even defeat. It was a masterful performance, Mamadou realized, watching the president's face as he spoke. Ibrahim was playing a role, and he was playing it perfectly. "Director Harrison," Ibrahim began, his voice slightly hesitant, "I may have been too hasty in ending our conversation. The situation in our region truly is delicate. Perhaps I need to reconsider my position." Mamadou could hear the American's tone brighten even through the phone. "That's wise of you, Mr. President. We want nothing more than to ensure your administration's success and the stability of Burkina Faso. Our partnership has always been mutually beneficial." Ibrahim pressed on, each word carefully chosen. "I must admit, I'm intrigued by what you mentioned about Operation Harmattan. I'd like to understand better how this program contributes to regional stability. Knowledge is power, after all, and I should be fully informed about operations affecting my country." It was a brilliant trap, disguised as capitulation. By framing his questions as coming from a position of cooperation rather than confrontation, Ibrahim was opening a door for Harrison to speak freely, perhaps even boastfully. And Harrison walked right through that door. "I appreciate your openness, Mr. President," Harrison said, his voice now carrying the comfortable superiority of someone who believed they had won. "Operation Harmattan is one of our most successful long-term strategic initiatives in West Africa. We've been running it for nearly 2 decades, though of course we prefer to keep a low profile." Mamado's eyes widened. He had set down his scissors entirely now, standing perfectly still, knowing that every word being spoken was potentially explosive. Harrison continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain his agency's cleverness. "The operation involves maintaining strategic assets within key governments across the region. These aren't just informants, you understand. These are individuals in positions of real influence, people who can guide policy decisions in directions that maintain regional stability and protect Western interests." "I see," Ibrahim said neutrally, encouraging Harrison to continue. "And which countries are part of this operation?" "Oh, Burkina Faso, certainly," Harrison said with casual confidence, "but also Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea. We've had varying degrees of success in each location, but the overall program has been remarkably effective. In your own government, for instance, we have assets in both the Ministry of Defense and the Interior Ministry. They've been very helpful in ensuring that certain policy directions are encouraged." Mamadou felt his breath catch in his throat. This was an admission of systematic infiltration, of undermining the sovereign governments of multiple nations. This wasn't diplomacy or legitimate intelligence gathering. This was colonialism in a modern disguise, controlling African nations through covert manipulation rather than overt military force. Ibrahim's voice remained steady, though Mamadou could see his jaw muscles working. "And my predecessor, President Traoré, what you said earlier about his cooperation?" Harrison actually laughed, a sound that made Mamadou's skin crawl. "Traoré was practical. He understood that fighting against the inevitable was futile. We provided him with intelligence, helped him manage opposition groups, even assisted with some of his more difficult political problems. He stayed in power for years because he recognized that our interests aligned." "And when they stopped aligning?" Ibrahim pressed. There was a pause, and when Harrison spoke again, his voice carried an edge of warning wrapped in false regret. "When leaders stop being cooperative, when they start making decisions that destabilize the careful balance we've maintained, they often find that their support base erodes quickly. Protests happen. Military coups occur. These things have a way of resolving themselves." The threat was clear. Ibrahim's own rise to power had come through a military transition. Harrison was implying, not so subtly, that such transitions could be engineered when convenient, that presidents who didn't play along could be removed and replaced with more compliant alternatives. "I appreciate your candor," Ibrahim said, his voice giving away nothing. "This is very informative. Perhaps we should arrange a more formal meeting to discuss how Burkina Faso can work within this framework." "I think that would be very wise, Mr. President," Harrison replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. "I'll have our embassy reach out to your office to arrange the details. I'm very pleased we could reach this understanding." After a few more pleasantries, Ibrahim ended the call. He set the phone down on the small table beside the barber chair and sat in absolute silence for a long moment. Mamadou waited, afraid to break whatever thought process was happening behind the president's eyes. Finally, Ibrahim spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear all of that?" "Yes," Mamadou replied, every word. Ibrahim turned to look at him directly. "Do you understand what this means? What you've just witnessed?" I nodded slowly. "It means our independence is an illusion. It means powerful countries still pulled the strings. They've just learned to hide the puppet strings better." "Exactly," Ibrahim said, a grim smile crossing his face. "But now we have something they don't know we have. We have a witness, an independent, unimpeachable witness, who has no political agenda, no reason to lie, no connection to intelligence services or foreign governments." Understanding dawned on Mamadou. "You want me to testify about what I heard." "Not just that," Ibrahim said, standing from the chair. "I want you to become part of history. What you heard today, Mamadou, isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about the dignity of every African nation, about whether we truly control our own destinies or whether we're still colonies in all but name." Mamadou felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His simple life, his safe existence cutting hair and listening to everyday troubles, was about to end. If he agreed to this, he would be stepping onto a global stage, becoming a target for one of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. "Mr. President," Mamadou said carefully, "I have a wife, 2 children. This shop is all I have. If I do this, what happens to them?" Ibrahim's face softened with genuine empathy. "I won't lie to you. There will be risks. But I promise you this. I will protect you and your family with every resource at my disposal. And more importantly, if you do this, your children will grow up in a country that is truly free, not one where foreign powers decide our future in secret phone calls." Mamadou walked to the front of the shop and looked out at Revolution Avenue. A group of school children passed by, laughing and chasing each other, their futures spread out before them like an unwritten book. What kind of future awaited them if nothing changed? What kind of country would they inherit? He thought of his father, who had worked 3 jobs to pay for Mamadou's education. He thought of his mother, who had always told him that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of guilt. He thought of the name of the very street his shop stood on, Revolution Avenue, named for the uprising that had brought Burkina Faso its independence decades ago. Perhaps it was time for another kind of revolution, not one fought with guns, but one fought with truth. Mamadou turned back to face the president. "When you asked me if I heard the conversation, I could have lied. I could have said I was focused on my work, that I heard nothing. But I didn't lie then, and I won't start now." Ibrahim's eyes shone with something that might have been relief or respect or hope, possibly all 3. "I'll do it," Mamadou said firmly. "I'll tell the world what I heard, not for politics, not for fame, but because my children deserve to grow up in a country where the truth matters more than the convenience of powerful men." Ibrahim crossed the shop and clasped Mamadou's hand in both of his own. "You're a brave man, Mamadou, braver than many soldiers I've known." "I'm not brave," Mamadou replied quietly. "I'm terrified. But sometimes being terrified and doing the right thing anyway is all the courage we can manage." In that moment, in a small barber shop on Revolution Avenue, 2 men from vastly different worlds formed an alliance that would soon shake the foundations of international power structures. The humble barber and the revolutionary president were about to take on an intelligence empire, armed with nothing but the truth and the courage to speak it. The question now was whether the world would listen and whether they would survive long enough to make it heard. That same evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across Revolution Avenue, a nondescript car pulled up behind Mamadou's barber shop. 2 men emerged, dressed in civilian clothes, but moving with the disciplined precision of security personnel. They had been sent by President Traoré's personal security detail, though they carried no visible weapons and wore no uniforms. Discretion was paramount.
Mamadou had closed his shop early, telling his last few customers that he wasn't feeling well. It wasn't entirely a lie. His stomach had been churning with anxiety since morning. He had sent his wife and children to stay with her parents for a few days, claiming there had been threats in the neighborhood, and he wanted them safe. She had questioned him, sensing something was wrong, but Mamadou had kissed her forehead and promised he would explain everything soon. Now, as he locked the shop door behind him and approached the waiting car, Mamadou felt as if he were stepping across an invisible threshold. On one side was his old life, simple and safe. On the other was uncertainty, danger, and a burden of truth that seemed almost too heavy to carry. The drive to the presidential complex took them through back streets and unmarked routes. No one spoke during the journey. Mamadou stared out the window, watching his city pass by in the fading light. Vendors were packing up their goods, families were gathering for evening meals, and children played football in dusty lots. Normal life, the life that he had always known, seemed suddenly precious and fragile. They didn't enter through the main gates of the presidential compound. Instead, the car was waved through a service entrance that Mamadou hadn't even known existed. They drove past gardens and administrative buildings until they reached what looked like a residential wing, quiet and protected by multiple layers of security that remained invisible but was undoubtedly present. Inside, Mamadou was led to a small conference room. The space was furnished simply: a large table, several chairs, recording equipment, and a Burkina Faso flag standing in the corner. 4 people were already waiting: President Traoré, the head of national intelligence, a legal advisor, and a woman introduced as a translator, though Mamadou's English was good enough that he suspected she was there more for precision than necessity. "Thank you for coming, Mamadou," Ibrahim said, his voice formal but warm. "I know this isn't easy for you." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Mamadou replied, surprised at his own calmness. Perhaps the decision had already been made that morning, and now he was simply following through on the inevitable. The legal advisor, a serious woman in her 50s named Aminata, explained the process. "We're going to record your testimony under oath. This will become an official government document, protected under state secrecy laws until such time as the president determines it should be released. Do you understand that what you're about to do could have significant consequences both personally and internationally?" "I understand," Mamadou said. "And you're doing this of your own free will, without coercion or promise of reward." "I'm doing this because it's right, because I have children who deserve to grow up in a truly free country." Aminata nodded with what might have been approval and pressed the record button on the equipment. What followed was a meticulous recounting of everything Mamadou had witnessed. He described the morning in detail: what time President Traoré had arrived, how the phone call had interrupted the haircut, the exact wording he had heard from Director Harrison. His voice was steady as he repeated the threats, the admission of having assets within the Burkina Faso government, the references to Operation Harmattan and its reach across West Africa. The intelligence chief interrupted occasionally with questions, clarifying details, asking Mamadou to repeat certain phrases exactly as he had heard them. The translator made notes, occasionally asking Mamadou to slow down so she could ensure every word was captured accurately. The most difficult moment came when Mamadou had to recount Harrison's implicit threat about President Kaboré's fate. Speaking these words aloud, in an official capacity, made them real in a way that simply remembering them hadn't. This was an admission that foreign powers had potentially influenced, even orchestrated, the political upheaval that had brought Ibrahim to power. He said, Mamadou's voice was quiet but clear, that Kaboré stayed in power because he cooperated, and when he stopped cooperating, things had a way of resolving themselves. Those were his exact words, and then he laughed. The room was silent for a moment after Mamadou finished. Ibrahim sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. The intelligence chief was writing notes furiously. Aminata had stopped typing and was simply staring at her computer screen, perhaps processing the magnitude of what they had just documented. "That's everything?" Ibrahim finally asked. "That's everything I heard clearly enough to testify to," Mamado confirmed. "There may have been other things, words I didn't quite catch, but I won't claim to have heard what I'm not certain of." Ibrahim stood and walked around the table to where Mamado sat. He placed a hand on the barber's shoulder. "You've done your country a great service today, Mamado, not just by testifying, but by having the courage to step forward in the first place. Most people, hearing what you heard, would have convinced themselves to forget it, to pretend they hadn't been a witness. Fear makes the cowards of us all, but you refused to let fear win." "I'm still afraid," Mamado admitted. "But my mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." "Your mother was a wise woman," Ibrahim said with a slight smile. "Now comes the harder part. We need to decide how and when to reveal this information to the world." Over the next hour, they discussed strategy. Simply releasing the recording of Ibrahim's conversation with Harrison wouldn't be enough. Audio could be dismissed as fabricated, doctored, or taken out of context. But a live witness, a common citizen with no political affiliation, no intelligence connections, and no apparent motive to lie, that was something much harder to dismiss. The decision was made to hold an international press conference. President Traoré would present the evidence directly, including both the recorded conversation and Mamado's testimony. They would invite journalists from across the globe, African media certainly, but also major international outlets, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, even American independent journalists who might be interested in a story of CIA overreach. "They'll come after you," the intelligence chief warned Mamado, bluntly. "Not violently, probably, not at first, but they'll try to destroy your credibility. They'll dig into your past, looking for anything they can to use to discredit you. Old debts, former girlfriends, any mistake you've ever made." "My life is simple," Mamado said. "I've never been arrested, never been involved in politics, never done anything more scandalous than occasionally staying out too late playing cards with friends. If that's the worst they can find, let them search." Arrangements were made for Mamado's protection. He would stay in a secure guest house within the presidential compound. His family would be brought there as well, though they would be told only that there had been a credible threat and the president was taking personal responsibility for their safety. Mamado would tell them the full truth after the press conference, but not before. The fewer people who knew the details, the lower the chance of leaks. As the meeting concluded and Mamado was being shown to his temporary accommodations, Ibrahim pulled him aside one more time. "There's still time to change your mind," the president said quietly. "I would understand if you decided this was too much to ask of an ordinary citizen." Mamado looked at Ibrahim steadily. "With respect, Mr. President, I'm not an ordinary citizen anymore. The moment I heard that phone call and chose to acknowledge what I'd heard instead of pretending ignorance, I stopped being ordinary. Now I'm a witness, and witnesses have a responsibility to speak." Ibrahim nodded that slowly. "Then let's make sure the world hears what you have to say." That night, Mamado lay in an unfamiliar bed in a room far more luxurious than he was accustomed to, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the next days would bring. His wife and children would arrive tomorrow, confused and frightened. He would have to find words to explain to them why their lives were about to change, why their father, the barber, was about to become a figure of international attention. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of scissors cutting through thick ropes, of voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand, of his children asking him questions he didn't know how to answer. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Media advisors briefed Mamado on how to speak at a press conference. Maintain eye contact with the cameras, speak slowly and clearly. Don't let hostile questions rattle him. Lawyers reviewed his testimony again and again, ensuring every detail was consistent, every fact was verifiable. Mamado's wife, Fatima, arrived with their 2 children, 12-year-old Karim and 8-year-old Aminata. The confusion and fear in Fatima's eyes when she first entered the secure compound nearly broke Mamado's resolve. She had married a barber, a man of simple means and simpler ambitions. Now she was being told that her husband had become entangled in international intrigue. That evening, after the children had been settled with a security officer who kept them entertained with card games, Mamadou sat with Fatima in a private room and told her everything. He watched her face cycle through disbelief, shock, fear, and finally a kind of determined pride. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the CIA threatened our president, and you're the only witness?" "Yes." "And you're going to testify about this in front of the entire world?" "Yes." Fatima was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. Finally, she looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "My mother always said I married a fool. She said you'd never amount to anything because you were too kind, too honest, too willing to listen to other people's problems instead of focusing on making money." Mamadou felt his heart sink. But then Fatima smiled through her tears. "I told her she was wrong. I told her that kindness was strength, that honesty was rare and precious, that a man who listened was worth 10 who only talked. And now you've proven me right in ways I never imagined. You're terrifying me, Mamadou, but I've never been more proud to be your wife." She took his hands in hers. "Whatever happens next, we face it together. The children and I, we're with you." Mamadou pulled her into an embrace, feeling some of the tension that had knotted his shoulders finally begin to ease. He wasn't alone in this. Whatever storm was coming, he would weather it with his family beside him. The day of the press conference arrived with cloudless skies and oppressive heat. By 9 a.m., the main conference hall at the presidential complex was filling with journalists from around the world. Camera crews jockeyed for position, testing lights and angles. Reporters reviewed their notes and speculated about what announcement could possibly warrant this level of international attention. The Burkina Faso government had been deliberately vague in its invitation, stating only that President Traoré would be making a major announcement regarding national sovereignty and foreign interference. The ambiguity had worked perfectly. Curiosity had brought journalists who might otherwise have dismissed the event as routine. Backstage, in a small preparation room, Mamadou adjusted the new suit he had been given for the occasion. It fit well, tailored to his measurements, but it felt foreign on his body. He was used to the simple clothes of a working man, not this formal attire that seemed designed for someone more important than he felt himself to be. President Traoré entered the room, dressed in a traditional Burkinabe outfit rather than a Western suit. It was a deliberate choice, Mamadou realized, a visual statement about cultural identity and independence. "How are you feeling?" Ibrahim asked. "Like I'm about to jump off a cliff and hoping I can fly," Mamadou admitted. Ibrahim laughed. "That's essentially what we're all doing in life, isn't it? Taking leaps and hoping we land safely? But remember, you're not alone in this jump. I'm right there with you." An aide knocked on the door. "Mr. President, we're ready when you are." Ibrahim nodded, then turned to Mamadou one final time. "Last chance to back out. I mean that sincerely. No shame, no judgment." Mamadou thought of Fatima's words, of his children watching from a private room via closed-circuit television, of the students who would one day read about this moment in history books, if indeed it became a moment worth recording. "Let's go tell the truth," he said simply. The walk from the preparation room to the stage felt both endless and instantaneous. Mamadou was aware of his heartbeat, loud in his ears, drowning out almost everything else. Then they were through the curtain, and the hall erupted with the clicking of cameras, the whir of video equipment, and the shuffling of bodies as everyone adjusted to get a better view. President Traoré approached the podium first. The room gradually quieted. Journalists readying their recording devices, pens poised over notepads. "Thank you all for coming," Ibrahim began, his voice calm and clear. "Today, I'm not here to make a speech or to engage in political theater. I'm here to present evidence of something that affects not just Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent, and indeed the principle of national sovereignty worldwide." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "3 days ago, I received a call. The caller was Director Harrison, from the Africa Division of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. What was said in that call represents a clear admission of foreign interference in our government, including the placement of intelligence assets within our own administration." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Journalists began whispering to each other, some already typing on laptops or phones, breaking the news in real time.
Rather than simply describe this call, I'm going to play it for you, Ibrahim continued. But audio alone can be questioned, can be dismissed as doctored or fabricated. That's why I've brought someone else to this podium today, a common citizen of Burkina Faso who, through pure chance, became a witness to this conversation. His testimony, combined with the recording, provides corroboration that cannot easily be dismissed. Ibrahim gestured, and Mamadou stepped forward to join him at the podium. The cameras swung to focus on this new figure, this unexpected element in what was already shaping up to be an explosive story. "This is Mamadou Urago," Ibrahim announced. "He owns a barber shop on Revolution Avenue here in Ouagadougou. For the past 15 years, he has cut hair, listened to his customers, and lived a quiet, honest life. 3 days ago, I was in his shop for a routine haircut when I received the call I'm about to play for you. Due to the small size of his shop, Mr. Urago overheard the entire conversation. He is here today to provide witness testimony to what he heard." The room exploded with questions, reporters shouting over each other. But Ibrahim raised his hand for silence. "Please hold all questions until after you've heard the evidence. First, the recording." The audio began to play, Director Harrison's voice filling the conference hall with crystal clarity. As the conversation progressed, the room became progressively quieter. Journalists stopped typing, stopped whispering, some with mouths literally hanging open as they heard a senior CIA official openly discuss having assets in a sovereign government, implicitly threaten a sitting president, and reference destabilization operations across multiple African nations. When the recording ended, the silence was absolute for perhaps 3 seconds. Then chaos erupted. Reporters were shouting questions, camera crews were jostling for better positions, and editors around the world were undoubtedly receiving urgent calls to drop everything and focus on this breaking story. Ibrahim waited for the noise to die down slightly before continuing. "Now, I'd like Mr. Urago to provide his testimony about what he witnessed." Mamadou stepped closer to the microphone, his mouth suddenly dry. He could see hundreds of faces staring at him, camera lenses like dark eyes recording his every movement. This was so far beyond anything he had ever experienced that it felt almost surreal, like he was watching himself from outside his own body. But then he thought of why he was here, of what those words on the recording represented, and clarity returned. He gripped the edges of the podium and began to speak. "My name is Mamadou Urago. I am 47 years old. I have owned a barber shop on Revolution Avenue for 15 years.
I am not involved in politics. I am not an intelligence operative. I am just a barber who, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, became a witness to something extraordinary. His voice grew stronger as he continued, the nervousness fading as the familiar rhythm of storytelling, of bearing witness, took over. This was not so different from listening to a customer's troubles, he realized. It was just on a much, much larger scale. President Traoré came to my shop that morning for a haircut, as he has several times before. He always comes without fuss, without ceremony, just a man getting his hair cut. During the haircut, his phone rang. The shop is small, only about 15 feet from front to back. Even though he moved to the far corner to take the call, I could hear everything clearly. Mamadou proceeded to recount the conversation in precise detail, his barber's memory for dialogue serving him well. He described Harrison's tone, the implicit threats, the casual arrogance with which the CIA official discussed undermining African governments. When Director Harrison mentioned Operation Harmattan, he listed several countries where they have what he called assets in government positions: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea. He said these weren't just informants, but people in positions of real influence who could guide policy decisions. A reporter from BBC interrupted, unable to contain herself. "Mr. Urago, how can we be sure you're telling the truth? How do we know you didn't mishear, or that you're not fabricating this for political reasons?" Mamadou looked directly at her. "Ma'am, until 3 days ago, I had never spoken to President Traoré beyond, 'Would you like the usual trim?' I have no political affiliations. I don't even vote regularly, if I'm being honest, because I always felt like politics was something that happened far above my head, something I couldn't influence." He paused, gathering his thoughts. But when you hear a foreign power casually discussing how they control your government, how they have people inside making decisions that affect your children's future, you realize that silence is a choice, and it's not a choice I could live with. Another reporter, this one from Al Jazeera, stood up. "Mr. Urago, aren't you afraid of retaliation? The CIA is one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world." "Of course I'm afraid," Mamadou admitted, his honesty evident. "I have a wife and 2 children. I have a small business that is my family's only income. Everything I've worked for my entire life could be destroyed because of what I'm doing today." He leaned into the microphone, his voice carrying across the silent room. "But my son is 12 years old. In a few years, he'll ask me what I did during this moment in our country's history. And I want to be able to look him in the eye and say I told the truth when it mattered, that I stood up when I had the chance, that I didn't let fear silence me." The room erupted in applause. It started with a few hands, then spread like wildfire through the assembled journalists, many of whom had covered countless stories of corruption, cowardice, and complicity. Here was something different, an ordinary man taking an extraordinary risk for no apparent gain beyond doing what he believed was right. Ibrahim let the applause continue for a moment before raising his hand for quiet. "We will now take questions, but I want to be clear. This is not about the United States as a country or its people. This is about a particular approach to foreign policy, a colonial mindset that assumes African nations are incapable of making our own decisions, that we need to be guided, controlled, or corrected by Western powers." For the next 2 hours, questions flew from every direction. Journalists wanted clarification on specific phrases, asked about Burkina Faso's relationship with the United States, questioned what actions the government would take in response, and repeatedly asked Mamadou to confirm details of his account. Through it all, Mamadou remained consistent, honest, and remarkably composed. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he was certain, he spoke with quiet conviction. His very ordinariness became his greatest strength. It was clear to everyone watching that this was not a man trained in deception or skilled in political maneuvering. He was exactly what he claimed to be, a barber who heard something he couldn't ignore. As the press conference finally wound down, Ibrahim made one final statement. "The recording you've heard today and Mr. Yarago's testimony will be submitted to the African Union, to the United Nations, and to the international community. We are calling for a full investigation into Operation Harmattan and demanding that all nations respect the principle of non-interference in the affairs of sovereign states." He placed his hand on Mamadou's shoulder. "This man, this ordinary citizen, has shown more courage today than many politicians show in a lifetime. He represents what every country needs, citizens who refuse to remain silent when they witness injustice, no matter the personal cost." Within hours, the press conference was being broadcast on every major news network in the world. Social media exploded with the hashtag #BarberWitness, with Mamadou's name trending globally. The story had everything: international intrigue, David versus Goliath dynamics, a sympathetic protagonist, and explosive allegations against one of the world's most secretive organizations. In Washington, D.C., panic set in at multiple levels of government. The CAI issued a terse statement calling the allegations unsubstantiated and questioning the authenticity of the recording. But their denial rang hollow, especially when independent audio analysts quickly verified that the recording showed no signs of manipulation. Director Harrison himself was placed on immediate administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. Congressional leaders from both parties, sensing political opportunity, began calling for hearings. The African Affairs Subcommittee scheduled emergency sessions. But it was in Africa where the real impact was felt. Within days, leaders from across the continent began speaking out. Nigeria's president called for an African Union summit specifically to address foreign interference. Ghana's parliament passed a resolution supporting Burkina Faso's right to investigate foreign assets within its government. Even traditionally pro-Western governments found themselves pressured by their own populations to take stronger stances on sovereignty. Student protests erupted in capitals from Dakar to Nairobi, with young people carrying signs reading "Africa for Africans" and "We are not puppets." The energy felt reminiscent of the independence movements of the 1960s, but adapted for a new era. This wasn't about throwing off colonial governors, it was about exposing the subtler mechanisms of control that had replaced them. In Burkina Faso itself, the internal investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, 5 government officials had resigned, including the Deputy Minister of Defense and a senior advisor in the Interior Ministry. Some resigned voluntarily, perhaps hoping to avoid deeper scrutiny. Others were forced out when communications with foreign intelligence services were uncovered. Each resignation seemed to validate everything Mamadou had testified to, proving that Operation Harmattan wasn't a conspiracy theory but a documented reality. Meanwhile, Mamadou's life had changed beyond recognition. He couldn't return to his shop, the security risks were too great. The building on Revolution Avenue became something of a pilgrimage site, with people from around the world coming to take pictures and leave messages of support. Someone spray-painted on the wall next to the entrance, "The place where truth cut through lies." Mamadou and his family remained in protective custody, though custody was perhaps too harsh a word. They lived in a comfortable residence within the presidential compound, with security that was visible but not oppressive. Karim and Amina were enrolled in the compound's small school, studying alongside the children of diplomats and government officials. The hardest part for Mamadou was the inactivity. He was a man who had worked with his hands his entire life, and now he found himself essentially in a gilded cage. He could walk the compound's gardens, read in the extensive library, spend time with his family, but he couldn't work. couldn't engage in the daily rhythms that had defined his existence. Ibrahim visited regularly, often bringing documents for Mamadou to review or new developments to discuss. A strange friendship had formed between them, built on mutual respect and shared experience. They had both taken enormous risks, had both stood at a crossroads and chosen the harder path. One evening, about a month after the press conference, Ibrahim arrived with a bottle of Ataya tea and 2 glasses. They sat in the garden as the sun set, watching Karim and Amina play with a football on the lawn. "I've been thinking," Ibrahim said, pouring the tea, "about what comes next. For you, I mean." Mamodo accepted the glass gratefully. "I've been thinking about that too. I can't hide in here forever. Eventually, life has to return to something resembling normal." "Normal may not be possible anymore," Ibrahim said gently. "You're too well known now, too symbolic. But that doesn't mean you can't find purpose." He set down his tea and looked at Mamodo seriously. "Universities want you to speak. The African Union wants to create a position for you, something related to citizen oversight and transparency. There are a dozen NGOs that want to hire you as an advocate for governmental accountability." Mamodo listened, feeling overwhelmed. "I'm just a barber, Ibrahim. I'm not qualified for any of those things." "You're not just a barber anymore," Ibrahim replied. "You're a man who stood up when it mattered, who told the truth when silence would have been easier and safer. That qualifies you for more than you realize." He leaned forward. "But here's what I really came to propose. I want to create a new government position, something that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. A citizen's advocate. Someone with the authority to investigate complaints about foreign interference or corruption. Someone who reports directly to the president, but also to the public. And I want you to be the first person to hold that office." Mamodo was stunned. "Me? Run a government office? I don't know the first thing about bureaucracy or investigation or—" "You'll have staff for the technical work," Ibrahim interrupted. "What you bring is something that can't be taught: integrity, common sense, and the trust of the people. When you speak, Mamodo, people believe you. That's rarer and more valuable than any degree or political experience." Mamodo sat with this proposal, watching his children play. Amina had just scored a goal and was running in circles with her arms spread like airplane wings, pure joy radiating from her small frame. Karim was arguing good-naturedly that the goal didn't count because she had been offside, though the lack of a referee made this impossible to verify. "Can I think about it?" Mamodo finally asked. "Of course," Ibrahim said. "Take all the time you need. But, Mamodo, whether you accept this specific role or not, you can't go back to being invisible. Your testimony changed things. Now you have a responsibility to see those changes through." That night, Mamodo discussed the offer with Fatima. She listened carefully, asking practical questions about salary, security, what it would mean for their daily lives. "But what do you want?" she finally asked. "Forget the practicalities for a moment. In your heart, what feels right?" Mamodo thought about his shop, about the simple pleasure of transforming someone's appearance, of listening to their troubles and offering what small wisdom he had accumulated. He thought about the life he had imagined for himself, quiet and modest and safe. Then he thought about Director Harrison's voice, about the casual arrogance with which he had discussed controlling African governments. He thought about his children and the world they would inherit. He thought about all the other ordinary people across the continent who had no voice, no platform, no way to fight back against forces so much larger than themselves. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've spent 15 years listening to other people's problems. Maybe it's time I tried to actually solve some of them." Fatima smiled. "Then you have your answer." The next morning, Mamoto told Ibrahim he would accept the position of citizen's advocate. The announcement was made a week later, and while some criticized it as nepotism or a publicity stunt, the overwhelming public response was positive. People felt represented, felt like one of their own had been given a seat at the table where decisions were made. Mamoto's first official act was to establish a hotline where citizens could report suspected foreign interference or government corruption. Within the first month, they received over 10,000 calls. Most were spurious, driven by personal grudges or misunderstandings. But some revealed genuine problems: government officials taking bribes, companies with suspicious foreign ownership bidding on public contracts, individuals making unexplained diplomatic trips. Mamoto assembled a small team of investigators, lawyers, and analysts. He insisted that they operate with complete transparency, publishing quarterly reports on their activities and findings. It was a revolutionary approach to governance, one that made officials nervous but citizens jubilant. The international recognition continued. Mamoto was invited to speak at the United Nations about the importance of citizen oversight in maintaining democracy. He received awards from human rights organizations, honorary degrees from universities, and countless requests for interviews and appearances. But he tried to stay grounded, to remember where he came from. Once a month, he would return to Revolution Avenue, with security discreetly positioned nearby, and spend an hour talking to people in the neighborhood. He'd sit with the old men who played chess outside the pharmacy, buy ice cream from the vendor on the corner, and ask the shopkeepers how business was going. "I need to remember," he told Fatima after one such visit, "that I'm not special because of anything inherent in me. I'm only here because I happened to overhear a conversation and chose to speak about it. That choice is available to everyone, every day. I can't let success make me forget that." 6 months after the press conference, the full scope of Operation Harmattan began to emerge. The international investigation, spurred by Burkina Faso's revelations, had uncovered documents, communications, and testimony from other sources that painted a comprehensive picture of the operation. It had begun in 2004, shortly after the Iraq War, when the CIA was seeking to expand its influence in regions that might become strategically important. Africa, with its natural resources and growing geopolitical significance, was seen as crucial. But overt military intervention was politically untenable after Iraq, so a different approach was adopted. Operation Harmattan, named after the dry desert wind that blows across West Africa, focused on cultivating relationships with mid-level government officials, military officers, and influential business people. These weren't crude attempts at bribery, but sophisticated long-term investments. Promising officials were identified early in their careers and supported with information, funding, and political backing. As these individuals rose through their respective governments, They maintained their connections to their CIA handlers. The brilliance of the operation, from an intelligence perspective, was that most of these assets didn't think of themselves as traitors. They genuinely believed they were helping their countries by maintaining strong relationships with the United States. The revelation sparked a continent-wide reckoning. Governments began scrutinizing their own officials more carefully. Several high-profile officials in different countries were forced to resign when their connections to Operation Harmattan were exposed. The African Union passed a landmark resolution establishing protocols for investigating and prosecuting cases of foreign interference. In Washington, congressional hearings became a media spectacle. Director Harrison was called to testify, though he repeatedly invoked his rights and provided little useful information. But other CIA officials, granted immunity in exchange for testimony, painted a damning picture of an agency operating with minimal oversight and a fundamental disrespect for the sovereignty of African nations. The hearings revealed that Operation Harmattan had cost American taxpayers over $300 million during its 2 decades of operation. That money had funded everything from lavish gifts to corrupt officials, to sophisticated surveillance equipment, to payments for informants. "What did we get for that investment?" demanded one congressman during the hearings. "We destabilized friendly governments, violated international law, and ultimately created the exact kind of anti-American sentiment we were supposedly trying to prevent. And for what? So we could have a few more yes men in African capitals?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Public opinion in the United States was divided. Some saw the operation as a necessary evil, arguing that every major power engaged in similar activities and that American interests needed to be protected. Others were horrified, seeing it as a continuation of the colonial attitudes that had oppressed Africa for centuries. But in Africa, opinion was united. The revelations had awakened a new sense of Pan-African identity, a recognition that the threats to sovereignty were continent-wide and required coordinated responses. Young people especially felt energized, seeing in Mamado's example proof that ordinary citizens could challenge even the most powerful institutions. A movement called the Barber's Legacy emerged, encouraging citizens across Africa to report suspected corruption or foreign interference. The movement adopted Mamado's philosophy, that silence in the face of injustice makes one complicit in that injustice. Mamado found himself becoming a reluctant symbol, his image printed on T-shirts and murals. In Dakar, an enterprising artist painted a massive mural showing Mamado holding a pair of scissors, with strands of hair transforming into chains being cut. In Nairobi, university students organized an annual Truth and Testimony Day in his honor. He struggled with this celebrity, uncomfortable with being lionized. "I'm not a hero," he told a reporter who asked about his feelings on becoming an icon. "Heroes are people who make deliberate choices to sacrifice for others. I was just a man who overheard a conversation and couldn't bring myself to pretend I hadn't. That's not heroism, it's basic decency." But perhaps that was precisely why he resonated so deeply. In an age of cynicism, of politicians who spoke elegant lies, and citizens who shrugged at corruption as inevitable, Mamado represented something simpler. The idea that normal people, in their normal lives, could still choose integrity over convenience. A year after the press conference, security assessments determined that it was safe enough for Mamado to return to his shop, at least during certain hours and with protection. The building had been maintained during his absence, preserved almost as a museum, but Mamadou insisted on using it again for its original purpose.
"If I just let it become a tourist attraction," he explained to Fatima, "then I really have lost who I am. I need to remember that I'm a barber. Everything else, the advocacy work, the speeches, the symbolic importance, that's all built on the foundation of being a barber who happened to hear something important." So Revolution Avenue Barbershop reopened, though now with security cameras and a panic button and bodyguards positioned discreetly nearby. Mamadou set specific hours. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, he would cut hair just like the old days. Appointments had to be made in advance and were subject to security vetting, but within those constraints, the shop functioned as it always had. The first customer was a young man named Usman, a university student studying political science. He sat nervously in the chair, clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "Relax," Mamadou said, with a gentle smile, draping the cape around Usman's shoulders. "You're just getting a haircut. That's all this is." "But you're Mamadou Urago, the Mamadou Urago." "I am a barber named Mamadou," he corrected gently. "What style were you thinking?" As Mamadou worked, gradually Usman relaxed, and they fell into conversation. The young man talked about his studies, his hopes of becoming a diplomat, his concerns about corruption he'd witnessed even in his university's administration. "Report it," Mamadou said simply, trimming around Usman's ears. "That's what the Citizen's Advocate Office is for. You have a voice. Use it." "But what if nothing happens? What if I report it and then I'm the one who gets in trouble?" Mamadou paused, meeting Usman's eyes in the mirror. "Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe you will face consequences. But I've learned something this past year. The only way to guarantee that nothing changes is to say nothing. Speak up, and at least there's a chance." Word spread quickly that Mamadou was cutting hair again, and the shop became a pilgrimage site for a different reason. People came not just to take pictures, but to sit in the chair, to have a conversation with the man who had become a symbol of ordinary courage. Each customer left with more than just a haircut. They left with stories, with advice, with the example of someone who had faced fear and chose to act anyway. One Thursday afternoon, a familiar white car pulled up outside the shop. President Ibrahim Traoré emerged, waving off his security details concerns, and entered alone. "Mr. President," Mamadou said, with genuine pleasure, "it's been too long. The usual?" "The usual," Ibrahim confirmed, settling into the chair. "Though I have to say it feels strange being back here, like we're trying to recapture something that can never quite be the same." Mamadou began working, his hands falling into the familiar rhythm. "Nothing's ever the same, but that doesn't mean we can't appreciate the echoes of what was." They were quiet for a while, comfortable in the silence. Finally, Ibrahim spoke. "I've been thinking about that morning, the morning everything changed. Do you ever wish you hadn't heard what you heard, that you could have remained just a barber, living a simple life?" Mamadou considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, when I'm worrying about security threats or dealing with the 1,000th interview request, yes, I wish I could go back to ignorance. But then morning comes and I see my children growing up in a country that's a little bit freer because people like us refuse to stay silent. And I think, no, I wouldn't change it." "Even knowing everything it cost you?" "Even then," Mamadou met Ibrahim's eyes in the mirror, "because the alternative, living with the knowledge that I heard something important and said nothing,
That would have cost me something more precious. My ability to look at myself without shame. Ibrahim nodded slowly. You know, I meet with presidents, generals, diplomats, people with tremendous power and education, but I'm not sure I've met anyone wiser than you, Mamadou. Wisdom is just experience plus honesty, Mamadou replied. I'm not smarter than anyone else, I've just had unusual experiences and refused to lie about them. As Ibrahim prepared to leave, he handed Mamadou an envelope. Don't open it now, he said. Just something I wanted you to have. Later that evening, after closing the shop, Mamadou opened the envelope. Inside was a letter handwritten by Ibrahim, along with a photograph. The photo showed the old leather barber chair, the one that had held so many people over 15 years. But someone had taken the time to restore it, reupholstering the seat, polishing the metal frame, preserving it while also renewing it. The letter read, Mamadou, this chair has held presidents and paupers, has witnessed confessions and conspiracies, has been the throne of truth in a world often governed by lies. I've arranged for its restoration and preservation. When you eventually retire, it will be placed in the National Museum, not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of what every citizen can be, a witness to history, a speaker of truth, a guardian of integrity. But until then, keep using it. Keep cutting hair. Keep listening. Keep being the remarkable, ordinary man who changed our nation. Your friend, Ibrahim.
Mamadou felt tears sting his eyes. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to his heart. 5 years after the revelations, the world had changed in ways both large and small. Operation Harmattan was officially dismantled, though cynics suggested it had simply been renamed and restructured. The CIA underwent significant reforms, with new oversight mechanisms and stricter protocols for foreign operations. In Africa, a new generation of leaders emerged, many of them directly inspired by Mamadou's example. They were younger, less patient with neo-colonial attitudes, more assertive about African sovereignty. The African Union established a permanent committee on foreign interference, staffed by citizens rather than politicians, following the model of Mamadou's Citizens Advocate Office. Burkina Faso itself had become something of a model for citizen-led accountability. The Citizens Advocate Office had expanded, with branches in every major city, and its quarterly reports were among the most widely read government publications. Corruption hadn't been eliminated, Mamadou was realistic enough to know that was impossible, but it had been significantly reduced, and when it occurred, it was more likely to be exposed and punished. Mamadou himself continued his dual existence, part-time barber, part-time advocate. His age had Wagner Odugu,